So this one is also an interesting question, which is array1, midThree. I'm going to show you two ways to do it, if that's all right. So we're given an array of ints of odd length. In other words, our array is not going to be even or have an even number of elements. That is to say, our length can either be 3, 5, 7, and so on and so forth, so long as it is odd. And so we're returning a new array, length 3, so we're always going to return 3 elements. And what those 3 elements will essentially be the elements of the middle of the array. So in other words, if we have an array of length 5, then the middle would be considered the 3 middle elements, which is of course these 3. Or in this case, where the length of the array it seems to be 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, 7. The middle 3 would essentially be these. So in each case here, you can see that we're grabbing the 3 middle elements. And of course, if the length of the array is 3, then we're just going to return all 3. So in my opinion here, we're definitely going to have to essentially work with nums.length to actually get those elements. So you could think of the first element in the array, which is I'm gonna call this num1, which will be essentially which will represent the first element in our new array. In fact, let's go ahead and make that new array first, or let's just call this midThree equals new int, and of course the length of the array will essentially be 3. So the first element in the array will essentially be nums.length, and this is, well, let's first actually just discuss sort of the approach here. So if we did in fact have, let's take this example. So if we have 5 elements in our array, for example, if we had 5 elements, and let me go ahead and zoom in here a little more, but if we had 5 elements in the array, 0, 1, 2, 3, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we have 5 elements, and of course the each of these elements are referenced by a corresponding index, which actually gives us access to the element in question. So if of course the name of this array was called nums, then simply saying nums sub 0 would give us access to the element which resides in the index 0, which is of course a reference to the element itself. And similarly, if we were to do nums of 1, then of course we'd get the element in that box. So in this case here, if I were to do nums nums.length divided by 2, would this in fact give me this element? And the idea here is if I can find the middle element, then I can just do whatever this nums of I is, plus 1 and minus 1, and get all 3 of these. So first and foremost, let's discuss whether or not nums.length divided by 2 is in fact the middle element. Well, nums.length is essentially the number of boxes that you see in the array. So the number of boxes here, we have 5, and so the length of the array is actually equal to 5. So when we do 5 divided by 2, we should in fact get a decimal number because it doesn't divide evenly. However, Java assumes that if you divide in this manner, then you're expecting an integer value. And so, because of course we've specified, and so in this case, what it does is it truncates the decimal. So whatever decimal this would reap, we would essentially forego all the decimals which come after that whole number. So in this case here, when we have 5 divided by 2, we'll have a decimal number, but we'll truncate all the decimal numbers, and then we'll just be left with a whole number. So we're going to sort of leverage that in this case. So if I were to actually show you that if we were to do 5 divided by 2, we'd get 2.5. But in this case, since it truncates the decimal numbers after the number here, the answer that we get is only 2. And you'll see here 0, 1, 2. We're actually referencing the second index, which is referencing the third element, which is in fact the middle element in the array. And so doing this is perfectly valid, and this actually gives us the middle of the array. So if I were to say, okay, I'm going to take mid3 and essentially the first element at mid3, which is of course the 0, is essentially going to equal it's essentially going to equal the middle, the element which is in the middle here. But I think I want to start with this number. So the first element in mid3. So if this was mid3 and this had 3 elements here, I want the first box to include the first of the 3 numbers that I have here. So I've accessed the middle element in the array, and if I do -1, it's going to store essentially this element here. And that should be, so this should be in my, so the second element in the array should now be the first element in mid3. Similarly, if I were to do mid, if I were to say, okay, now what is the first what is the second element in the array going to be referenced, of course, by the first index? Well, in this case, I would just want it to be the middle number, because of course before I had this and now I'm having this, which is just the second number which follows. So that's just going to be the middle number. Nums.length, which is 5 in this case, divided by 2, which is 2.5, truncating the decimal, we're just left with 2. And 2 is of course the index, which references the element in question. And for the last element here, which is of course going to be at index 2, which is referencing the last element, we are essentially going to say, okay, well, this is essentially the middle, and if I add to the middle, then I'll get the second, or the number which directly follows it. And that, of course, should lead me to having a new array of those values. Now, it's interesting because another thing that I want to say is that the middle of the array, so if we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We would think that if we were to do nums.length divided by 2, we would get the middle number which resides in the array. And while that's true, I actually want to tell you that, okay, so if we have 5 elements here, each of course referenced by their indexes, you'll notice that if I say, okay, int mid is equal to what? Well, if I do nums.length -1, then I'm saying that okay, nums.length -1 is equal to 4. So we're actually on the 4th index here because we have nums as a prefix to our to what we're doing here. So we actually have 4, and if I divide that by 2, I get the middle element each and every time. Divide that by 2. So you'll see here, even if I had seven elements here, the middle of the array would essentially be this. So if I did nums.length -1, that would give me 6 because the length is 7, divided by 2 would give me, so nums.length -1 would give me 6, divided by 2 would give me 3, and that's of course also the middle of the array. So that's another way to get the middle of the array. And just to sort of demonstrate here, I could say, well, nums.length divided by 2 -1. If I were to do nums.length -1 divided by 2, I would still be able to. I'd get array out of bounds. Not too sure why. I think it's because That's interesting. Why would that be? Why would that be the case? Nums.length -1. Oh yeah, I actually have to put this in its own bracket, or maybe it does -1 divided by 2 first, and then nums.length. Okay, so that's fine.